July 21st, 2021 PCEF Grant Committee meeting. And we're going to start, as we always do, with some just virtual participation check and guidelines. These committee meetings are open to the public. The public is invited to comment at around 6:05 p.m., be a few minutes after that today. The public is invited to participate in conversation with committee members during the break, which will happen at 7 o'clock. That only works if you're logged in via Zoom. For folks on YouTube, you'll just see a slide that says break. There are, however, opportunities for public engagement in other forums and meetings, and just by reaching out to staff. The chat box is generally reserved for staff and committee members, but we'd like to invite everyone to introduce themselves in the chat box now and indicate if you're interested in providing public comment. If you could put your name, if you have an organizational affiliation you want to share, and gender pronouns that you want to share, you can put those into the chat box now, and then we'll introduce you after we do committee and staff introductions. The raise hand function is likewise generally reserved for staff and committee members. And we ask folks to keep their video off unless they're participating in the meeting, because it just makes it easier to organize and kind of keep track of the Zoom screen. This meeting is being recorded, and it's also being live streamed on YouTube. There's a recording of it available on that YouTube channel afterwards, which you can find by going to our website. There's also closed captioning. Oh, actually, it looks like maybe we don't have closed captioning, live captioning on the Zoom tonight. I'm not seeing it. And James, I didn't see the captioner come online. So apologies for that. But there will be closed captioning available on the recording that is posted and then online afterwards. So before we move on to introductions, we usually start our meetings with an opening inspiration. And I'm going to ask committee members to help out tonight by reading through our guiding principles to kind of ground ourselves in the purpose of the program before we jump into the meeting and start kind of taking on some heady topics. So I'm going to go to the slide at the very end of this presentation, which has the guiding principles on it, so that folks can, if you don't have them memorized, read them off of the screen, and ask for 4 committee members to volunteer themselves, maybe take one each.
I'll kick it off. Can you hear me?
Thanks.
PCEF is focused on climate action with multiple benefits. Invest in people, livelihoods, places, and processes that build climate resilience and community wealth, foster healthy communities, and support regenerative systems. Avoid and mitigate displacement, especially resulting from gentrification pressures. All right, Shanice, if you're up for it.
Justice-driven, advance systems change that addresses historic and current discrimination, center all disadvantaged and marginalized groups, particularly Black and Indigenous people.
Community-powered. Trust community knowledge, experience, innovation, and leadership. Honor and build on existing work and partnerships, while supporting capacity building for emerging community groups and diverse coalitions. Engage with and invest in community-driven approaches that foster community power to create meaningful change.
Accountable. Implement transparent funding, oversight, and engagement processes that promote continuous learning, programmatic checks and balances, and improvements. Demonstrate achievement of equitable social, economic, and environmental benefit, and remain accountable to target beneficiaries, grantees, and all Portlanders.
Thank you all for that. And I'm going to start with introductions. for folks who may have joined the meeting a little bit late, who are members of the public, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat box, that would be great. Just put your name if you have an organizational affiliation, and if you have gender pronouns you want to share, just put those in there. And we'll start with committee members. Maria?
Maria Sippin, she or they pronouns, committee member.
Ranfis?
Ranfis Dantino Iatoro, committee member, he, him.
Shanice?
Shanice Clark, she, her, committee member.
Michael?
Michael Eden Hill, he, him, committee member.
And Robin?
Robin Wang, committee member, he, him.
Faith?
Hi, everyone. Faith Graham, she, her, committee member.
Okay. And Amanda Squinfanyazi, committee member, is going to be joining us a little bit late, and Jeffrey Moreland and Megan Forrest are both excused tonight. I'm going to move on to staff who are participating in the meeting, and I'm just going to start with myself and end with Sam, because Sam usually picks up the introducing members of the public. So I'm Katie Lister, PCEF staff, and I use she, her pronouns. And Angela Previdelli is going to be our note taker tonight. Angela?
Right, Angela Previdelli, she, her, and I'll be your note taker.
James?
I'll hand it. Oh.
Hi, everybody. James Valdez, he, him pronouns, and member of the PCEF staff, and I'll be the tech lead today. If you do have questions, go ahead and you can chat to me, and I'll try to help you.
And Sam.
Thank you. Hi, folks. My name is Sam Barrasso. With the PCEF team, I use he and him pronouns. It's good to be here with you all. Well, as the evening is very nice, and I assume many folks would like to be elsewhere. So thank you for being here with us. I want to just thank folks in the audience, and then just see that we've got with us tonight. Let me scroll up here. It's a little longer list. All right, we've got Kathy Tuttle, she, her. Tonight we've got Don Mekodrum. Apologies if I mispronounced he, him, his, from Energy Trust of Oregon, or TRC, New Construction Program. We've got Deidre Schutz, she, her, Nutrition Garden RX. We've got Jenny Hall, Energy Trust of Oregon, she, her, Solar Program. We have with us Kelly Fan, she, her, with ERCO. We've got Laura Jones, representing ELSO, ELSO, using she, her pronouns. Jenna Hammer, PCEF staff, she, her. We've got Julia Garver, with Innovative Housing. Wendy Kalfkin, PCEF staff, she, her. Dan Meek, attorney interested in PCEF's mission. Thank you. David Granfield, PCEF staff. James Donnelly, Elevate, as well as Kathy Sharp, Portland Fruit Tree Project, she, her. And I'm going to scroll up and make sure I didn't miss anyone else. I think that's it. So we've got a great group of folks with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Before we jump into the agenda, I wanted to ask if folks had the opportunity to review the June 16th meeting minutes, and if there were any edits, corrections, or comments on those. And if not, we would call them approved. All right, I'm seeing nodding and thumbs up and no objections. So that's for the June 16 minutes, and those are approved. There was one public comment that was submitted over email. Committee members have received it, and it'll be in the meeting minutes for this meeting, just for members of the public who might be interested in that as an option for submitting public comment in the future as well. So I'm going to scroll back to the beginning of the presentation. Maybe next time we'll get those guiding principles up front. And we're going to pass it. And then I didn't see anyone interested in providing public comment, although one new person did put their name into the chat, and that's Jill Inahara from NAACP, she, her. So I'm going to pass it back to Sam to give us, to sort of reground us with a timeline and give a few program updates before moving into a discussion about the 2021 heat emergency.
Thank you, Katie. All right, let's move to the next slide, and then I'll just walk through some of the timeline. So just to kind of ground folks in where we are, we are at this 21st meeting today. We'll talk about the evaluation findings, but there's another piece that we did add to the agenda late last week, and that is discussing the heat events and potential PCEF response. So we'll get through those evaluation findings, and then next week, and you should see towards the end of next week, you're going to start seeing drafts of this next RFP. So we'll start sending those to you with the idea that it's really going to be a place where we're going to be capturing all the changes that you've seen leading up to now that we've discussed in the past several months. And then we'll come back on our August 4th meeting, discuss those drafts, hear folks' feedback, and then hopefully get to a place. And I think this next conversation we have may certainly change this, but get to a place where we hope that you all may be ready to make a decision to release the draft request for proposals for public comment. Those will go out for public comment for a few weeks. And we'd hopefully have at least a public listening session with you all in the middle of August, with the idea that as we wrap that public comment period up, we come back to you all with some of the changes and recommendations, and hopefully get to a committee decision on releasing the final RFP with those changes in early September, with the plan to release the RFP, the next RFP in late September. So most of our work is really just focused on tightening up those details so that we can bring that forward to you all next week. But there's a few other key program updates. One, I'm really excited to announce that we, several weeks back, we completed our recruitment for our PCEF Clean Energy project manager, and I'm excited to announce that Wendy Kafken, who's with us here and who was on assignment supporting us and filling that role for the past year, did get the permanent position. So really just excited to share that with you all. And so I know, Wendy, I don't know if you want to be on camera, but Wendy is here, and I'm sure you all can send your kudos, but we're super excited to have her here in that permanent capacity. And so that keeps that workflow in terms of those clean energy projects smooth, and Wendy's been working with all those grantees already, and so that work continues. Our mini grants, our first set of mini grants, our first quarterly round of mini grants proposals are due August 1st. So just acknowledge that, so that as folks are thinking about that and think about other organizations that may be contemplating applying for PCEF or anything else, and think that that sort of smaller application, smaller set of resources may help them, please just keep that in mind, and we hope you send that out. And we're certainly sharing those resources and sharing that information out to make sure folks are aware of that. But this isn't the last chance, and there'll be certainly next quarter, and this is a quarterly program, so it's just the first deadline. And then just the last piece is we're busy at work executing our grant agreements, and so we're still working on executing our grant agreements for the first round, and we're just getting up to speed where we're now seeing them come through at a regular pace. But it's just to show that while this year is certainly it's our first year going through this process, it all takes time. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we're busy at work doing that as well. So I just want to share that, and I just want to see if there's any questions about a few of the pieces I shared, whether the timeline or some of those updates, before we move on to the next agenda item. Okay. All right. So I know I've checked in with several folks about this, but essentially, I think as the region, as our public bodies have been really reflecting on the tragic events that played out in late June and early July, it's really been, we recognize that it's really important to make sure we create space within this committee, given the task of this committee, the work of this committee, as well as the resources this committee is tasked with administering, that it's important that we certainly create space to talk about that heat event, a heat event that certainly climate modelers and many others have projected as some of our worst case scenarios, but something that we oftentimes project as once in a many 100-year type event and happen. And so an event that's likely, unfortunately, to happen again in the future. So we wanted to create space to talk about that event and what's PCEF's role in responding to that. I want to acknowledge that our next RFP and our future RFPs,
I do want to go there
RFP.
like one night, either tomorrow or whatever. So it'd be nice.
Did this person come?
I'm going to go ahead and perfect. Thank you, James. So our next RFP is certainly set to create a platform for folks to put together proposals to address that. But just recognizing the timeline of our RFPs and the fact that while we may release it and we will release it in September, as we come around, as we go through our evaluation process, that it would likely be, March, April before we get to a funding decision. And then, sometime will we be rolling out those grant agreements this time this year. So we wanted to make sure we create space within this conversation to say, how do you all want to be thinking about this? And so I don't, certainly we have a lot of thoughts that staff have deliberated and been thinking about this over the past few weeks, but wanted to just open the floor and share the floor so that folks can begin the conversation and share any reflections, and we're happy to respond. And so I will say in this instance, we are not setting you all up with a particular question or thought in that way. It was really important that we make sure that, and I know I've checked in with folks around just the context of some of the conversations that have been happening regionally, but we just this really is meant to be a space where you all get to have conversation with each other and talk about how, any thoughts you may have around PCEF and the heat event and potential responses.
Do you want to kick us off
maybe
with
before
questions?
Yeah, maybe before I even say that, and I'll just
I saw Ranpeace's hand up, but I wasn't sure. Michael, if you had a question or
I was just asking Sam if he could give us a little, sort of what we have been talking about, a quick, brief overview of potential responses for PCEF, as opposed to give us sort of a place to start this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. I think the context for the conversation has been that regionally, both whether the county, the state, as well as the city have been in a range of conversations around how as public institutions they respond to future events like this. These are conversations that we wish had happened years ago and that we would have planned for in that way. So there's a whole host of regional conversations I've been having, but some of the conversations have certainly also steered to, okay, is there a role for PCEF to play in some of these? Given what PCEF was designed to do in terms of invest in clean energy projects that address climate resiliency, address community, advance racial and social justice. And so what we've been really checking in with and seeing is as we've been making sure we feel prepared to respond to folks, we've been thinking through and acknowledging that our next RFP would not really, if folks put proposals together to weatherize, address homes, that it really wouldn't be, folks wouldn't be situated in a way that they could actually put those projects in the ground and get them to move before next summer. So you really would have another summer. And so some of the conversation we want to hear from you all is, one, is there an interest in seeing PCEF do something sooner in order to be more responsive and be situated so that we do have solutions that might address a future heat emergency prior to next summer? I want to acknowledge that this summer, we're in the middle of the summer, and this summer, I think that it's fair to say that there's not much we within PCEF can do, but certainly other things that the Bureau of Emergency Management and others are thinking about in terms of opening buildings in the future. So I think that it's within the context of PCEF. Is that something folks would be interested in, and then we can certainly open up the conversation and respond to thoughts that are coming up. Does that help, Michael?
Thank you very much.
Ranpeace?
I originally put my hand down. I think Maria's next. I'm happy to go after Maria.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad that this is brought forward to us to have a discussion here in this space. I think our discussion could cover at least maybe what are the boundaries for PCEF on how we can be responsive to climate events, not just heat. I think we could cover all kinds of events, and we've seen several since PCEF's inception. So I'm wondering if we can get a little bit of an overview of what are some of the boundaries around that. How can we be aligned with PCEF's values, but also be aligned with the code. And I know the code has its ways to prescribe where PCEF can and can't go around this topic. But I think being responsive to community as soon as possible, it should be priority for us. And it is helpful to get that context that our next RFP may not allow us to be as responsive. So what options do we have to escalate this issue and to roll it out if we are interested in pursuing ways to meet some of the community's needs around heat, especially.
Francis?
Yeah, I'm glad that this is on the on the agenda, and I just want to echo Maria's comments here on thinking of beyond just heat. We just had a extreme winter weather event this last year. Last year we also experienced wildfire smoke. I think we were all impacted, and I think this is central to the question around how our communities are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And so I think there's a lens here in terms of how workers are being impacted. And I think not all workers are being impacted the same way. But, I think we've heard countless stories of workers who had to show up to work during our extreme heat event, and how workers were not protected during that heat event, and how we saw casualties. I think the same can be said for our least protected community members in our city, folks who live in dwelling units who either through requirements through their lease agreement can't install an HVAC system. I think there are things that we need to be discussing, and probably our impacts to influence that may be limited. And same with folks who are houseless. How do we ensure that our investments, our grants, are protecting those most vulnerable in our communities to these extreme weather events? So I would definitely, I'm definitely interested to hear not just from our committee, and I'm definitely interested to hear from our staff, but I'm definitely even interested to hearing from if we have the time to let some of our attendees here to weigh in as well. But I think it is really important. I think there are ways that we can be part of the solution, whether one, we're requiring, employers or contractors who are benefiting from PCEF grants, that they are, setting responsible standards for how workers show up to work on extreme weather events. There are things that we can probably do for investments in building and retrofits, to making sure those benefits are being received to all residents, and that we're thinking strategically about how we're protecting or being proactive in emergency events that I think we're currently not situated to protect our most vulnerable communities. I'll pause, but I'm really interested, again, just to hear from other folks, and hopefully we can extend this to staff to share their thoughts, as well as those in public attendance.
Michael?
Yeah, I was, I guess when I had a discussion with Sam, we were talking about also an emergency response, sort of a one-time or a one-time way to kind of protect people from, try to protect a lot of people from future events. Because we know that climate change is real, and it has happened, right? It continues to get worse. This is going to happen over and over again. Every year, wildfires are worse because it's hotter, it's drier, it's windier out west. And it's just going to continue. These heat events are going to continue. And I think that many of us knew that this was coming, and just we haven't prepared for it as government entities, as pseudo-government entities, as communities. We've been woefully unprepared for what was what at this point is inevitable. So I guess my, you know, I think that I think that we do have a responsibility to try to do something like hopefully by next summer that can have a large effect. But some of my concerns are it feels like PCEF is the only climate response initiative in Portland, Multnomah area. Currently since we're just here in Portland, I'm just gonna say in the city of Portland right now, that it's coming down to PCEF dollars and this committee to address climate related issues in the city. It feels like we have people see that we have funding, and so that that we're slowly becoming the de facto organization to try to go to fund climate resilience. I guess yeah, I'm gonna leave it there until we get into more specifics, and I'm gonna let Sam decide how specific we want to get.
Thanks, Michael. Faith?
I was going to ask Katie if you could actually put up the slide again with our principles, our guiding principles.
Sure. We're going to have to cruise through all of them, but they're there again.
There we go. Perfect. I just want to appreciate everything everyone else has said already and the caution that's been indicated. When I talked to Sam about it, I would say both wholeheartedly and cautiously optimistic that we have a place to play in this. Play, that's the wrong wording. Sorry about that. That we have a role and a responsibility associated with this. It feels like I agree that it's not every catastrophe that these dollars should be responsive to, but it does feel like we have that this particular responsibility relates to both community powered, justice driven, and accountable to our communities. And I would want to be sure that any solution that we devise is all three of those things as well. And particularly the community powered. So I think we really need to be looking to our community partners who are most impacted by the heat surge that happened in June for the solution on how we could help mitigate in any way that solution. So I just wanted to pull us back to this to make sure that any response that we think is appropriate is actually grounded in all of these principles, and particularly that this has to be a climate action that is multiple benefits that are benefiting those that have been traditionally most disadvantaged and marginalized. I don't really have anything more to say, but I know that there are more specifics that I am really interested in hearing about, but it sounds like we're at this level of the conversation right now.
Thanks, Faith. Robin?
Yeah, hi. I echo kind of a lot of the comments that was said, and Faith, I appreciate you bringing up this guiding principles because I was going to kind of talk to this, and so I'm glad that it's up. I think, I guess the only additional comment that I want to say is I'm very wary about city-led initiatives to pursue some impact or purpose. While it may be very beneficial, or the intent is very good and it's intended to be a good impact, I'm very wary about city-led initiatives, kind of addressing things, and really want to stick to these guiding principles. Really want to whatever we do, make sure it's grounded and rooted by the community, and whatever solutions, to address the effects of climate change and to enhance resilience are really led by the community and not by city government or any government. And I want to emphasize that, we spent a lot of time developing a grant making process that is anchored in these, guiding principles. And to the extent that we can, whatever we do, I think we should stick to, the processes and the systems and the procedures that we have in place, because they are rooted in these guiding principles. If we allocate, X dollars to some other entity and say, okay, you guys can decide what to do, I'm not confident that they're going to be grounded in these guiding principles. So like I said, I think whatever we do, it should be grounded in these guiding principles. I also appreciate the time lag that exists. We're here now in the summer, given the PCEF time cycle and all that type of stuff. Funds are not going to hit the streets until spring, summer of next year. I get that, and maybe we can do something as a one-time. But I think if we agree that this is going to happen again and again, and not just heat, but wildfires and flooding and other effects of climate change, I would be open to kind of allocating X dollars annually, and having community organizations propose solutions on how they see would best enhance the resilience of their communities, given some of these future emergencies that will happen. So like I said, I echo a lot of the other comments and concerns, and just wanted to add that I really think whatever we do should be grounded in these guiding principles.
Thanks, Robin. Denise?
And I'll be brief, because I also want to say that I'm resonating with a lot of comments, especially Peace and Robin. And I think PCEF absolutely has a place to figure out what the role should be for us to mitigate some of these emergencies. And I resonate with thinking about beyond heat and recognizing the last couple of years. I also have in an ideal world that, distributing funds and making the magic happen in this emergency context. I'm trying to imagine what the people power looks like to make that happen. And I'm not sure. So I'm curious about what it is that is possible in sort of this emergency timeframe, but absolutely needs to be community driven. And I think as we think about these guiding principles and how access to relief is really looks different for communities across our region, that having these targeted responses that might lean on more grassroots organizations that may or may not have the same structures as others. I think grassroots organizing really shows up in emergency situations. And so I'm curious about our role in supporting relief in that way. But yeah, it's more just questions, I guess, that I have lingering and just resonating with what folks are thinking. I think your typical bodies doing emergency response, I want to think about what that pathway is, where maybe there's capacity or people power given to these efforts for communities of color. What does that look like? I think is a conversation to figure out, but that's what's circling through my brain.
Thank you, Shanice. Michael?
Hi, I was gonna mention that this 115, 110 degree plus days, multiple days in a row, isn't just about comfort in supporting resilience in the communities. It's about survivability, right? At those temperatures, we're talking about like the survival of human beings, which is what makes this, I think, bumps it up a little bit more importantly, right? And to reach large numbers of folks takes, unfortunately, it feels like it takes governments working with community organizations to do that kind of work. Which is just because it's such a heavy lift so fast as sort of an emergency response. That being said, government emergency responses are often not justice driven. They are not equitable. They are not interested in community power. And they seem to often go unaccountable as far as like what actually happens on the ground. So what Robin was saying is very true. Like all these things in an emergency situation, when handled by government authorities, government offices, often seem to go kind of in the opposite direction of what our guiding principles are. So and I know what's been suggested out there, and I think I have a lot of questions about it. I have a lot of concerns about it. I want something that's not going to do more long-term harm than good. I think that we need. I think we definitely need, if we have interest in looking at an emergency response for this year, to kind of do buffering for the next several years. Buffer again, create a little bit of resilience, a minimal buffer, perhaps like a chance of survivability. That we look into it much deeper and get a lot more answers before we just go full on into it.
Michael, you said something earlier that makes me even more curious about all the things that bring up cautiousness and concern for people. I think you mentioned that your concern is around PCEF being like the go-to to kind of come to the aid when these things are happening. I want to know how we could be responsive, but also not forget or not absolve like all of these systems that have been causing harm, and how do we at the same time provide resources, but also continue to heavily put pressure around the ways that people build housing, the ways that employers do not provide for the employees when these heat events happen, whether it's like lost wages or creating safer places for folks to work. So how do we do that? Do a little advocacy while also doing a little bit of mutual aid as well. I just kind of wonder what else gives people concern and other things you might be interested in PCEF kind of pushing on.
I just want to thank you all for those thoughts, and I'll share a little bit, recognizing that I know that there's going to be folks who want to continue more, and I know that I've connected with each of you just to make sure that you all felt prepared for this and to talk through some of the things the staff have been thinking about. And so I think what folks are raising in terms of both the fact that these events are going to continue to happen, and what is PCEF's role versus being prepared as a region for these events, and making sure that PCEF, which was a community resource, isn't necessarily the go-to. I don't want to discount the fact that these very same and different conversations happened early on during COVID, and we had to be much clearer about sort of what PCEF was tasked with doing, and that was a longer term. A lot of the investments we talk about, whether it's tree planting or retrofitting homes and doing deep retrofits, which is the gold standard, are generally speaking take significant more outreach and significant more implementation times. And in our best case scenario, I hope we will be, we'll be spinning those projects out 200 to 300 a year and then some. But as I shared in our context, I think regionally, as we've looked at initial data, we recognize that as we look at those that did tragically perish in the heat waves, that many of those folks, lived on third floor. Many of them lived in apartment buildings. Many of them lived on third floor apartments in these apartment buildings where they tend to get hotter. Nearly, I think, with the exception of 8 of them, all of them, none of them had air conditioning. Of the 8 that did have air conditioning, 7 of them did not work. And so, as we recognize that a lot of the solutions within PCEF, whether it's tree planting or those whole home retrofits, I mean, tree planting, it's a real long-term solution that may take 10 to 30 years to get these home trees to maturity and create reasonable shade. And so a lot of what the conversation for folks in the audience, and I welcome, I will share. As folks talk about, this particular meeting, fortunately, we rotate every one of our meetings. In this particular meeting, when we get to our break at around 7 o'clock, there will be an opportunity for breakout rooms where folks in the audience will be able to join in the breakout rooms and converse with committee members. So we hope you stick around till at least then. But and so in this context, the immediate sort of thing that certainly comes to top of mind, while recognizing that what we want to do over the long term is work with both homeowners as well as landlords and others to retrofit these units and make them efficient, but also keep people in those buildings as that's happening. That in the short term, a lot of the solution is efficient types of air conditioning and heating units that ideally are more efficient than existing units, but at least from the air conditioning perspective, bring something into a unit that folks would not otherwise have that can keep folks cool. Those sorts of solutions don't come without their downsides. And that, I think, Michael, as you and I talked, I mean, as we've run the numbers, we'd expect that folks wouldn't just be turning those units on when it's the hottest of days. They'd run them when it's hot. So you'd expect to see anywhere bills go up anywhere from $30 to $40 a month. So there's downsides and there's longer term needs around work the state is doing around low income rates and other things around our energy bills. But in the short term, these solutions that we're talking about truly are stopgap solutions. They're solutions that would be getting into homes and distributing these sorts of units, which would range anywhere from $300 to $700, and with the idea that ideally those are homes that are earmarked for future deeper investments. This isn't too dissimilar from what New York City did last summer when they distributed 70,000 AC units, although there wasn't necessarily the heating and AC component is going to be a critical component to it. But we're open, and I think that these are we've gone from like technological, as we reviewed what has happened. These are some of the things that have come up. So we certainly know that these aren't the only solutions, but wanted to certainly speak to those. And these solutions, at least air conditioning units or heat pump air conditioning units, don't address houseless folks. They don't address folks that don't have permanent, that don't have permanent shelter with a power source, and so, or an enclosed shelter. So I think I want to just acknowledge that there's no perfect sort of solution out there, and I think that it is collectively on obligation of all of our regional entities and others, including our utility partners and others, to be thinking through what's sort of their role. And so I'm sure I know that I'll share that, and I see your hand, so I'll share that and pause and hear other reflections.
Michael.
Sorry, I'm taking up an inordinate amount of face time here, but I guess I did some, because when Sam was talking about the portable heat units, I did just some quick rough calculations on them on what I could find online, and the estimate was like around 22,000 units. That adds 10 on the conservative side to 20 megawatts of additional power during the summer onto the grid. So my question is, how do we offset that power with clean energy? Not instantaneously, but we're adding 10 to 20 megawatts of consumption to the grid, which is no small amount. I my personal home, which is, during the daytime without air conditioning running, we pull about 8 amps. We have very low loads. And our air conditioner, our heat pump pulls 16 amps. So it pulls more than our entire house does normally, just the air conditioning load alone. So we're adding 22,000 to apartments that may be pulling, 5 or 6 amps of power. That's a technical thing, but that's pulling a lot more power off the grid. How are we going to offset that? Because it builds resilience, creates safety systems, increases survivability of heat events, but it also means we're using more power. And some of that's coming from coal burners, and some of that's coming from gas burners. I think that how we're going to offset that additional carbon load that we will now be responsible for is an important question. And also who are some of the partners that we can cost share this with, and who are some of the partners that can help us with offset.
Ranjith?
I don't know how to follow up Michael. Give it for an electrical worker to ask us some really some critical questions here. I think this is a great conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing more public input and from others on the committee. I like the suggestions of how we use our values here, and how we sort of at least for me, as I'm seeing this, is how do we leverage our resources to center this for community, to power community? I feel like a lot of these problems feel overwhelming because they're really big problems. But I think it's just gonna keep reminding ourselves that we're just one player. And so we should be challenging other institutions to step up and do the kinds of work that we've needed to do for several decades. So I think there's going to be a lot of long-term systems change, and I think we've already mentioned utilities in this conversation. We've already talked about other public governments. This is an area where other businesses are going to need to step up, and if PCEF can play a small role or drip in the bucket, if you will, and if there's ways to sort of leverage that and center that around community and empower community to hold those other institutions accountable. I think we should explore that and what that can look like, whether it's in an emergency basis or a proactive basis through our current grant making structures. So I'm kind of excited. I think kind of the directions I think we're all kind of going here, and just acknowledging what feels overwhelming. But I think just reminding ourselves, just want to remind, let's just try to break the problems down that I think feel manageable, and see what we can move together in this space, and while acknowledging it might not be enough, but I think that just finding those actionable items, I think can be meaningful and can help influence some systemic change. So I really enjoyed this conversation thus far.
Michael, I will share the comments you raised, and I appreciate both. Ramsey, I appreciate those comments, and Michael, I will just appreciate your math, because I think as we've gone back and it follows our conversation, we've been checking in. What I will share is, as walking out of this conversation, is important that we hear from you all, how you all get some direction from you all, and how you all want us to proceed. I think we're getting that, and we're hearing a lot of the intent around how it would look and what are the things you're going to need, and what this allows us to do is go back and check in with our utility partners, check in with folks like the Energy Trust, and check in with others to see sort of where that is. And at times, while may seem like far away, I think it's important to know is that and I think what we're hearing is that there is a desire to do something or see up options that may address that may put something out there so that folks are in a more resilient position next May. But that does mean that does have implications on timeline, and so those are some of the things we'll be thinking about. But I know I saw a couple of hands, and so I'd love to certainly hear more. But those comments around, Michael, that you made around just what that means in terms of summertime load is very real, and we're certainly looking in and teasing out with these portable heat pump units, AC, which they say heat pumps, so folks out there, they provide cooling and heating. It's also just balance and understand sort of what do they do on the winter load, and what is it, because those typically are going to be more efficient than electric resistance heating, cadet heaters, those sorts of heaters that tend to be found in, unfortunately, those just lower cost affordable or lower cost rental units. So I think there's work to be done to tease this out, and we're certainly eager to hear more thoughts from you all around some of the questions and information you that would be helpful for you as we come back and think about this.
Just saw Shanice come back on camera, so I just want to make sure that Shanice, did you want to share? Do you have anything?
Not now.
Okay. All right. Great. Just didn't want to have you come back on camera and then suggest that we move into break, because that's kind of the time on the agenda right now. I know that, and Rampeus, mentioned a desire to kind of hear what other members of the public who attend these meetings, what their thoughts on this are, and I think that that's the kind of, after a 5-minute break, we'll have 15 minutes in breakout rooms where committee members and members of the community can chat with each other. And then maybe, Sam, go ahead.
I just have one more comment I want to make, and I think it's important to share before folks go out in the breakout. And it's just, we're certainly, as we hear from folks and get some direction, we'll certainly be going back and checking in with community partners. It is important for us to have this conversation first with you all. In some preliminary conversations, we'll share that just the nature of distributing, and Michael, you said 22. I think we have that the total number is 56,000, or we estimate based on some numbers, 56,000 households in the region without any air conditioning, and we sort of ballparked what piece of that maybe the relevant piece for PCEF given our priority populations, low-income folks and people of color. So we're, as part of that. We in some conversations, I just want to acknowledge there is a real exhaustion within the community, and so we're going to have to get creative. And to the extent that we start hearing from folks that this is of interest, we may have to get creative around what distribution, warehousing, sourcing, all that looks like, just because community organizations in many instances are very tapped. And I don't want to speak for everyone, but you're certainly hearing just between the vaccination drives, the mutual aid, the food boxes, everything else, there's a lot of exhaustion. And so I put that out there so that folks have the conversation. I didn't want to leave that context out there because it's important context to share.
Thanks, Sam. Appreciate that. So maybe after we come back from the break, if we can take just a couple of minutes if committee members want to kind of share any thoughts and reflecting on the conversation, and then Sam, you can kind of wrap it up and talk about next steps, and then we can move on to the next topic in the meeting, so we can give that some time too. We'll certainly be returning to this conversation again. So does that seem like it works? Okay. So it's 6:58. I just because it never works unless we round. Let's say that we're going to be on break until 7:05, and then, or that's sort of the true break, and then we'll go into breakout rooms for conversation from 7:05 to 7:20. So we'll start the break now and be ready to go into breakout rooms at 7:05. Thank you. I'm gonna turn it over to Sam. Sam, if you wanted to, actually, I'd like to invite, maybe just take a couple of minutes and invite if any committee members kind of want to share any thoughts from your conversation with community members. I think that would be great. And then we'll pass it over to Sam for sort of next steps and next item on the agenda. Francis?
Yeah, I could try to summarize in our group, and I'm happy for other folks to chime in. But Kathy, I'm going to butcher the organization's name, but I think shared a recent Washington Post article highlighting some case models of cities that are implementing some good practices around community resiliency and responses. So I think Philadelphia was highlighted as a case study example. I feel like Jenny Hall, Energy Trust, shared some good perspectives around community connectedness and thinking about sort of the problems that I think that Michael had raised. We also heard this sort of desire around thinking about some of our proposed, thanks Sam, with the fruit tree. I think I think we heard an example or a desire to see some of the proposed community sites, public buildings for responses for houseless to be sort of community resiliency centers. Hopefully I captured that well, but folks, I don't know if there's anything I captured incorrectly or just missed from our conversations.
Thanks, Francis. Michael?
I think you captured that great, Ramphis. Thank you. Sam and Katie, are you guys looking for a go-ahead for doing a little bit more research and delving into this a little bit more before our next meeting, or do you want a go-ahead for that from the committee?
I think what I was going to share, and I wanted to confirm, was what we're hearing is yes. What we're hearing is from committee members is yes. Come back with something, and we're going to go back through pretty diligently through the notes just to make sure we're hearing all of and captured all of the sort of the pieces that folks want to see. So at least we can speak to them as we come back in the next meeting and say, okay, we sort of what we generally heard was go ahead, come back with something that is a little bit more responsive. And just shaping out how that fits both with our next RFP, could fit within our next RFP, but how that could fit within the context of putting something in place by next May. So I think generally we were hearing that with a lot of different, with certainly making sure that it aligns with our guiding principles around, in addition to other thoughts that we'll go back to the notes and see. So I guess I wanted to iterate that and just share that's what we're hearing. And so if folks have something else, that would be the expectation on our end. We will turn back around, flesh out some of the ideas we started working on within the team, and really think about them in the context of some of the feedback you all have shared, and come back to you all in the August 4th meeting with something more fleshed out, so that you can give us either the go ahead at that point, or we may need to have further conversation.
All right. Well, unless there are any other comments right now, then I think we should move on. We're a little bit, and maybe I did see a hand raised. It is from a member of the public. I think we can kind of, because we were talking about those conversations, I'll offer the floor to this one member of the public, but I would then like to move on to the next agenda item because we're running a little bit late and it's a fair amount to cover. Don?
Hi, I'm sorry for missing the breakouts. And I'm not sure if this was covered or even if this is appropriate to share, but I did have an idea during the conversation that as the committee thought about the appropriate way to respond to the heat event and potential smoke events and other things that are going to be totally related to the mandate of PCEF, that conceivably the PCEF committee could develop statements of need around certain areas that act as sort of a template for anyone who wants to apply for a PCEF grant. And so that to sort of just give people a head start and sort of identify, instead, if the committee doesn't want to sort of be proactive and be governmental, then could sort of create a sort of a framework for respondents to PCEF grants to sort of have a head start on specified needs. So I just wanted to share that notion.
Thanks, Don. All right, I'm gonna share my screen again and then hand it over to Sam, and let's move on to the next part of the meeting agenda. There will, of course, be other opportunities for members of the public and for committee members to provide more input on this issue.
Okay.
Sam, do you see my screen?
I do. Thank you.
Okay.
It's up and
great.
It's different. All right. So I think just as we come into this next section, and for members of the public, we did upload, and there is a memo associated with our evaluation findings and staff recommendations that we're going to discuss related to the next RFP. It is on our website, and we'll put that in the chat box shortly, so folks can find that, so folks can track along. As we come to this, despite the heavy topic that we were chatting about earlier, last year was this was our first RFP, or request for proposals, that we released. And there's a lot that we learned in it, particularly given that something like this hasn't necessarily been done before. And there's sort of the breadth of what PCEF does was something we've always reckoned with would be hard. And so it was really important, given that this was the first time that we did this, and given that we're going to be scaling up, that we do an in-depth evaluation and review every element of the work that we did to make sure that, how can we improve those things? How do we make them better? And so to that, I just want to really thank and applaud the work that Janet Hammer, who has led these efforts, has done alongside PCEF staff, as well as a phenomenal team of interns from both from PSU as well as I forget the school in Northeast, another liberal arts school. So we had a great crew of interns that have worked with us. Swarthmore, maybe. Okay. Anyways, that's not the point. The point is we did a really great work in going back and digging back into everything. And so we're just going to walk through what the evaluation findings really touched on, what we evaluated, and then go through at a high level and talk about some of those evaluation findings, which are going to be in the memo that is linked on our website. Next slide. So our evaluation and elements of our evaluation included just debriefs and interviews and an evaluation of application data. So there's many different elements to this. Now, we conducted debriefs with our review panels. These were the individuals that actually scored the applications. So we conducted debriefs with them. We conducted debriefs with the PCEF staff that were involved and did the eligibility screening. This was to make sure, the initial pull-in of applications, because that was a bit of it was a scrum, and I had the fortune of missing that because I was out for a couple of weeks as we had our second kiddo. So just congratulate staff to that, but there was a deep evaluation and debrief with staff around how we could do that better. As well as there was a debrief with folks that did the technical review, making sure, are these projects technically feasible? And then a debrief and discussion with staff that did the greenhouse gas emission scoring to see how we could improve that process for next round. We also conducted interviews with 7 out of the 9 committee members. And then we listened to community in a number of ways. We conducted 22 interviews with a range of applicants representing each of our different funding areas, folks who are not funded, folks who were funded, and 13 of those 22 were BIPOC-led organizations. We listened for insights when we had meetings with folks that wanted to discuss their application. So we had a lot of debrief conversations with applicants that had either feedback, wanted to get feedback, or wanted to hear why they may not have gotten funded. And when we were conducting outreach to folks as we were talking about funding opportunities. And then lastly, we evaluated all of the application data, and we just considered things like whether certain types of funding buckets tended to have higher scores or lower scores, whether organizations of certain types scored higher or lower, and whether organizations whose leadership reflects the community they serve scored well, and just whether certain questions didn't give us actually much information or not. And so overall, I'll just share that the evaluation findings tell us that there is a whole lot to celebrate about our inaugural RFP, along with certainly opportunities for improvement. And so with that, I'll move on to the next slide and then come back to this too. So overall, there were no major flaws in the first application or in the review process, and there was just a lot of appreciation expressed by folks that were interviewed for the committee, for the committee and staff's commitment to engagement, transparency, responsiveness, as well as just centering equity. Folks appreciated that we had webinars and application support grants that were made available to help organizations apply. They also appreciated the opportunity to respond, to ask and hear back to respond to clarifying questions that we had, as well as their draft scores, and just appreciate the way that the application accommodated different types of projects as well as organizations. So I think those are some of the key areas of appreciation. Next slide. All right, so then key areas for improvement. There are a few overarching themes that emerge regarding potential improvements. First, there are some applications that would benefit from application questions that would benefit from clarification regarding what we were asking or what project types need to answer certain questions. And you'll see where we're going to be making those improvements as you get the draft application next week. Examples include creating separate applications for different funding types, revising the demographic questions, improving the budget template, and then just clarifying the greenhouse gas emissions question. Secondly, we saw that there are several or a few questions that could be just dropped or scored differently because they didn't really add to the review. Examples include removing the employee benefit question, modifying the workforce and contractor information on the application, simplifying the financial information, as well as just adjusting the review process and making sure and identifying supports that may be needed then, rather than include some things in the scoring. Third, there was just a desire to simplify the application and make it less chunky. This includes changes to our application portal, as well as reconfiguring some of the questions. And then fourth, there was just a desire to identify better ways to tell a more holistic story from applicants, and just to complement, their written narratives with other communication media. There is always a piece that folks wanted to tell this broader story, and I think we heard that as well from reviewers that wanted to be able to capture and evaluate the broader application. So we'll talk about that shortly. And then fifth, it was just there was areas for improvement on additional ways in which we could support our applicants, and folks discussed some of that. As part of our review, we also identified a number of areas where there's contradictory feedback, right? So there's just these dualities. For example, some applicants thought the process was easy and one of the best they had applied for, while others thought it was difficult. Some applicants appreciated the information we shared, while others thought it was just too much information. Some folks appreciated that there were word suggestions, but others saw those word count suggestions as limits. And so a little bit of work to do there in terms of landing and how we need to share that a little bit better. Some folks appreciated that due date was pushed back in recognition of community need, while others did not like that. And so I think these contradictions certainly just reflect that we are aiming to serve a broad array of applicants, different project sizes and types, as well as organizations with varying levels of capacity and grant expertise. And so there's just I'd like to just acknowledge it's just huge kudos to staff on this, but it's fortunately we know that there are a lot of areas we can improve this round, and we'll certainly continue to improve in the grant rounds to come. And so before we kind of move into the next slide where it starts to get up, I just want to kind of pause here and see if there, as we're going to get to more specific findings, and we'll probably just really pivot to the memo itself. I would like to just pause here and see if there are any questions about the actual evaluation process, how we went about that, or any of the key higher level themes. Oh. Next slide. Okay. So now I think at this point, I'm just going to go through and list some of the things that are going to be in the memo. And what I think we might do is, you know, we're going to make sure folks, I think everyone in the chat box can access this memo. This is for folks that are viewing via Zoom. We would say that the memo, if you go to Portland Clean Energy Fund, and let me just, it's portland.gov/BPS/clean energy. And you go to our meeting link at the bottom of the page, you'll be able to find a link to this memo that we'll be talking about here shortly. And so what we're going to talk about in the memo and what we'll walk through at a high level is just, you know, there are a few areas that we really dug into that are going to be key areas for changes, other than all the little minor changes that we're making. That was, you know, the financial review, which we've been, I know that Robin has been collaborating, giving us feedback on that process and has given us more recent feedback. But there's the changes to financial review, updates and changes to the way we do our greenhouse gas emissions impact evaluation, and how we ask those questions, changes to the employee benefits, changes and findings around the organization, and how organization is reflective of the community served and how the project benefits priority populations, findings and changes around our workforce and contractor utilization questions, as well as our workforce and contractor development proposals, and then findings around just this concept of having a holistic approach to assessing a project story, as well as just talking a little bit about some of the application support resources. Leading up, so those are the elements in the memo. I highlighted 5, 6, and 7 because I think those are areas that if folks are quiet, I think those areas we're going to want to spend a little bit more time talking about. But I want to acknowledge that leading up to this, we also hosted a community workshop on June 22nd to really talk about, as we sort of stepped back and thought about some of the key findings that were coming out. We thought about what are some bigger level changes that might address a lot of the themes that came up, a lot of the themes that were coming up as potential frictions. And so those 3 areas of feedback that we discussed with the community, and this isn't in the memo, but was about whether there was a desire for a non-written application material. So we're talking about there videos and audio. And so we asked folks that in order to, you know, increase accessibility or make it easier for folks that may not prefer, you know, the written word may be more challenging. What were folks' thoughts on allowing that as a mechanism to provide some application answers where relevant? We discussed with folks just the different ways in which we were thinking about providing applicant support. And then we discussed with folks this concept of shifting to planning grants, of taking an implementation grant and a process where an implementation grant that may score lower in its scope, but otherwise meet a lot of our other objectives in terms of an organization that's serving a population we want to serve, a concept where we work with them and see if they don't quite get there, whether there'd be an interest in shifting to planning grants. So we can chat about that as well, but I wanted to speak to those are some of the 2 areas where we've got the feedback we discussed in our workshop, and then some of these other areas where we've identified findings as well as recommendations. So there's a lot there. There isn't really a perfect way to go through it. I know that we certainly speak to it in the memo, but what we think we might do, if folks are okay with it, we might stop our screen share, kind of just go through a few of those sections and see if questions are coming up, and let it flow a little bit more like a discussion around things that questions folks may have. So before I jump in and kind of work through some of the sections, are there any, for folks that, folks have reviewed this, is there anything folks want to initially start out and ask? And I can obviously jump in and just start sharing, but I want to see if there's anything that stood out to folks around findings in the memo or recommendations or staff recommendations on how we might address some of those findings. Is there anything that stood out to folks that you want to start with? Let's start with maybe the juiciest then. So I highlighted in the slide before, a few sections where we thought it'd be worthwhile to discuss today. And some of the others, I think you all can review, and we welcome you all reviewing those. And to the extent you have questions, want to chat about those, we welcome folks coming back to us on those. But I'll just start with the workforce and contractor utilization questions. So specifically for folks in the audience, this is for all the implementation grants for the most part. There's questions related to the particular workforce. This is contractors as well as workers that would be employed on a project, and various commitments to diversifying both the contractors, subcontractors, as well as workers, having apprentices on those projects, as well as commitments around wages and benefits. So that's the section of the application that we're talking about here with workforce and contractor utilization. In this section, some of the findings that we had is just that there's a lot of questions regarding the workforce and contractor commitments were not viewed as viable. They were just really challenging. And so I certainly want to acknowledge that this first round, our grant cap was $1 million. And so we had a range of applications, but this was, there's going to be we anticipate and expect a different sort of conversation next round as we see grants higher as well. A second finding is that the workforce and contractor equity were not considered for regenerative agriculture projects as well as green infrastructure projects, except for the sort of traditional construction related components of those projects. So we didn't really ask workforce or contractor equity related questions for folks that were doing tree plantings, planting food crops or other things like that. It was really focused on those that were more in the traditional construction trades, such as electrical trades, carpentry, and other things like that. Okay, so with that, then, and as part of responding to this, one of the key recommendations staff are working through right now, and you will see this next week, is that we're recommending that we adjust the application so that applicants are not required to identify their contractor. That was a requirement for projects that were investing at least $500,000 over a single site. And so this would reduce the level of detail on project contractors, subcontractors, and workforce for large projects. Now, in lieu of that requirement, where in the last application, we required that contractors be identified, what we were doing is that we're going to be instead for projects over that threshold, and I think what right now we're landing at is about $350,000 at a singular site, that those particular projects will simply be required to meet program defined diverse contractor and workforce utilization goals, as well as apprenticeship utilization goals. So we tried sort of this race to the top approach, and I think what we want to go back and see is it's going to always be conversations and work with grantees, but instead requiring that they commit to those goals. And as a starting point, so that folks know what we're looking towards right now is Portland Housing Bureau goals as a starting place for those goals. Okay. And then one of the other recommended staff changes is that equity in contracting will be scored for all contracts, not just those for construction. And so this will be consistent with conversations happening in this broader fair contracting forum that the city is engaged in, as well as in alignment with items that we're already tracking in our grant reports. So we wouldn't be tracking equity just for those construction projects, but for a wider array of our projects. All right. So I know that there's going to and I will share that I know that maybe I'll just stop talking right there and see what's coming up.
Robin?
Yeah, a few moments ago, Sam, you made a comment around changing the workforce diversity and equity, and instead of the race to the top, kind of established goals that the project is going to pursue, the Portland Housing Bureau goals. And I guess my question is how enforceable or how accountable is that? My limited interactions with these type of projects is that sometimes, the firms that are the firms that are doing the work, they can switch like at a moment's notice, or they play games to kind of pad the numbers a certain way. So I'm just kind of, wary about how accountable, what you're proposing can be.
I appreciate that, Robin. I think that, right now, the way that we've framed it, and you'll see this next week, is we ask about the strategy. So we are asking still for applicants, like, what is their strategy for recruiting diverse contractors as well as subcontractors, as well as in certain instances, we'll ask about their strategy for workforce. But, what we saw was that most folks weren't really able to secure contractors at the proposal development phase, or secured contractors might end up backing out. And so it was, I think your point around the challenges that other bureaus have faced is I don't want to pretend that we're not gonna have to wrestle with those same challenges. I think that one, we can hold folks to their strategies. The challenge with, and this is just, I almost feel like this is an area where we may need to consider, and I welcome. I'm more than happy to set up an executive session where we can talk with city attorneys around sort of how we negotiate some of that enforceability, because it is, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. There are things that we can enforce around strategies and making sure that, hey, have you picked up, have you called, have you done all these things? When it gets to their particular commitments, it gets a little more hazy in terms of the enforceability. And I would say that I don't want to go beyond sharing that. I think it's worthwhile to almost have just the city attorneys talk through this and you all do. So if that's something that we're happy to set up an executive session, because that is ultimately it comes into the legal realm. So it would be an executive session where you'd be talking through this with city attorneys, because they'd be offering legal advice. So because I don't want to pretend that there's that this is something that we could do that other bureaus, where other bureaus have sort of failed. I think it's something that we're gonna have to negotiate, figure out, and work with grantees on.
Denise?
I'm still kind of processing, but I do have one kind of question that's coming to mind, and I do kind of think that it makes sense to look at our questions and make them clear and concise here. But as I'm reflecting on this contractor piece, it's certainly not unusual for grant funded dollars to name contractors and what they'll be doing, and things do change. And I think there is, outside of the contractor realm, what does it mean when things change within the context of a PCEF grant? Because they probably will. And so if that contractor changes, I think that's okay, and that's kind of what happens a lot. But to take a step back and only give guidance with the, or ask questions rather around the recruitment and efforts to identify a contractor, I guess I have hesitation around what it means, what that could mean. And I think the original intent here is to, as we're thinking about our PCEF values and folks who may or may not have a really direct impact on a particular project, to really make sense of what their role will be. And so I think there's more room to explore this conversation, but in a way that doesn't make it rigid, because I don't think it makes sense to say, this, to assume that every single project we fund, like something like that, no hiccups will happen. I think that it's okay if a contractor changes, and that I guess I'm having some feelings about that one. But there's that.
Ramses?
Yeah, I think just kind of want to remind, I think where we may have started early on the contractor and workforce language, and I think where the exploration of a race to the top concept was I think early on it was difficult to figure out how to set requirements around workforce equity and contractor equity that were enforceable or stringent or that weren't aspirational. I think with that limited of time, I think they're just getting, I think disclosure was a potential vehicle, but I kind of agree. Like, I don't think necessarily the way the applications were ultimately structured, like ultimately created that race to the top. At the same time, I just want to remind folks the problem, which is, there's not a lot of diverse contracting. Like, I don't know of any diverse women or Black-led solar firm. If we were to look at the diversity within Energy Trust's allied trades in the contracting realm, not really diverse. So I think, I do sort of sympathize with the challenges from some of the grantees around making commitments and making goals, and the possibility of, those goals or commitments changing because contractors change. But to me, that still is minuscule to the systemic problem that we see, which is a lack of contracting and workforce equity opportunities that is part of the mission here and some of our goals here at PCEF. So, I do want to find some kind of constructive solution, whether it's an outright, requirement to meet certain goals. I am kind of concerned, but if staff feels like they have the capacity of negotiating some of these workforce or contractor equity goals and commitments after dollars are awarded, but that does seem like a high volume of negotiations, and I just don't know. It seems like once you fund groups, like you're losing the opportunity to really know what the commitments are. And really, there's not much for negotiation about what we're asking folks to do if they don't think it's feasible. All in all, to say it's really hard questions, not a lot of easy solutions. I continue to be a champion of creating things like a high roads committee, experts within the workforce and contracting world that are continually wrestling with these questions and trying to move institutions like Portland Housing Bureau and Energy Trust to do better. And I feel like we should create the space for us as a institution here in PCEF to be challenged by those workforce and contractor equity advocates to, help us do better. I will highlight one just kind of innovation, just an example, right? Recently had a conversation with the folks at San Francisco PUC, outside the box thinking here. They get some of their contractors working on their projects to upfront say what their commitments are for workforce equity or what are their workforce needs. If they can't meet their needs in terms of meeting diversity, they just backfill their workforce needs with existing pre-apprenticeship graduates. It's an outside the box thinking. I'm not advocating it for here in this space, but there are creative solutions outside of our jurisdiction that's trying to move the needle of workforce equity that at some stage, I think it makes sense for us to think outside of Portland Housing Bureau, outside of the city of Portland around how we're moving the needle on equity. I'll pause there, but I think I'm just kind of, I think, agreeing with the needed changes, but I think, I just want to highlight business as usual. It's not going to move the needle on contract and workforce equity. I think there's going to be a need for deeper engagement with stakeholders on fine-tuning this. And that's both true for construction, but it's also true for regenerative agriculture and in other spaces.
I thank you, Ramses. This is a hard space. It's an incredibly hard space, and it's I think it's vexed many folks for a long time, and so it's I don't know, Katie, if you want to chime in on just some of the negotiations. I don't want to discount that we've done quite a bit of work with in back and forth with our grantees to get to a place where we feel collectively comfortable to move their grant agreements forward. So I don't, but there is implication. They're just, you're absolutely right, and that does take time. And so one thing I would just, there's this. A lot of this does happen. It is going to take time, and there is this broader ecosystem that I think at some point soon we're going to need to start wrestling with around how some of that 20 to 25% of dollars going towards workforce and contract development, how those are coming into play into these projects a little more tightly. And right now we're I think folks are still figuring out what that's going to look like for them organizationally and what kind of proposals they can pull together. But in the meanwhile, I will just acknowledge that I don't know necessarily, and Robin, this may be to your point, I think I should have mentioned, I don't know necessarily that this new method would make anything less enforceable or change accountability. It's simply that being able to send more clear signals around what we expect to see, but there are legal elements to holding folks to particular numbers that we do get into tricky waters, and I think it's worth. I just acknowledge it's an area that is a constant area of learning for staff, in acknowledging that I'm more than happy to for folks in the committee, to the extent that there is interest, that we can bring together our city attorneys that are sort of focused on this to talk that through in an executive session. But a lot of our focus is on the strategies and making sure they're doing at least what they've said they're going to do from a strategy perspective.
Michael?
Yeah, I just want to back up with what Ramfi said. I think that we're in a unique position to kind of like push the contractor equity bar forward, to raise it up, and I understand that getting to contractor equity takes time, it takes startup, it takes commitments to contractors, to new contractors, to getting them off the ground. But I think that we are in a unique position to kind of to push that here at PCEF.
Robin?
I just want to say, I'm happy to have those conversations, with the attorneys, but my gut feel is saying that that's probably not going to go anywhere. I think this problem is beyond, talking T's and C's around awardee terms and objectives and whatnot. And I think there's an opportunity, and I don't know what that is right now, but I think there's an opportunity, for PCEF to be a catalyst to do something really different, a different approach to solving this, problem, cracking this nut. Again, I don't know what that is, but I think, we are in a unique opportunity to fund and convene the conversations to try to address this problem in a different way. So I'll just leave it at that, because I don't know, I don't have any ideas around that, but I just feel like there's something different that needs to be done.
I want to. I see Ramfi your hand up. I want to. Yeah. No. I was.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Robin just said. Like, I think convening stakeholders makes a ton of sense. Like, I think there's a scenario here, in the reality, like, there are folks who are graduating in a pre-apprenticeship programs that are never being hired for an opportunity to work in the construction or manufacturing industry. Like, there are contractors who are claiming like they can't find the workforce. I think there's a lot of knowledgeable experts in this space who can inform us. There's a lot of folks who can inform us, like, where is the noise signal ratio? Like, where is there's bad communication and why folks aren't being hired or retained in these positions? Like, and I think thinking like those are the folks I feel like make a ton of sense to engage in the space to sort of help us answer these questions. But I think there is a creative solution. Just us talking amongst each other, just talking directly legal, I don't think gets us that much closer either. I kind of agree in that sentiment.
So, and one thing that we haven't, that's something that certainly as we go around and we talk about PCEF and folks ask us, the fact that 20 to 25% of this fund is dedicated towards workforce and contractor development is significant. And I also don't want to understate the fact that, this first year we went out with 8.6 million, but as we do go to scale, it's going to force organizations that have historically not been resourced this way, historically not really had that sort of reliable resource to be able to think about how they want to support elevating and diversifying contractors within the space and within our community. So I think I appreciate all the sentiment. I think you're absolutely right that PCEF is certainly very, very much in the space to be a catalyst, and that we're just getting going. And so I think that's a piece that we didn't have to get fully appreciate because of the smaller funding round year one.
If I could just quickly respond, Sam, to that point, just to be clear, like I think like business development is great, right? Contractor development, but if those investments develop contractors don't get utilized, that's its own separate challenge. Like funding for contractor development is one challenge. Getting them utilized is another challenge. And I think PCEF is on both sides of those equations to be able to answer. I think it's same really true for the workforce development piece. We can invest and get 80 folks trained, 80 graduates, but if they're not hired, that's really problematic too. Like that's another area of its own challenge. And even if you get those workers hired, how do you keep those retained? It's its own, separate challenge. And some of these questions are even outside of the scope and realm for these grantees. At the end of the day, these are decisions of how grantees hire these contractors. Some of these decisions really is a systemic issue of the practices of some of these contractors. Sorry, I'm not trying to diminish, I think, what you're saying in terms of the investments. I think I'm just trying to highlight where adding money isn't necessarily the solution. There's another portion of the equation, which is how do we fully realize that return on investment in contractor and workforce development, which is sometimes outside of our own decisions, is how they're being utilized. So sorry, I don't mean to go further deeper, but I just wanted to share that nuance here.
Ramses, I appreciate that. I think it's an important nuance. That I appreciate that, and it's hearing that again. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Michael?
I think that, sorry, I'm a little stuffed up and a little sick. I think that the idea is that workforce development happens. Contractors hire people out of the workforce development program to work on clean energy, green infrastructure, ag. And then that's sort of, and then we do also contractor development. Hopefully some of those folks become contractors in the future. But it seems, and this is anecdotally, is that, I have heard from solar contractors that they don't know where to reach out and find women, people of color, Black folks to work. And I'm like, there are a bunch of pre-apprenticeship programs out there that are turning people out that are totally qualified to work for you, and then giving out names. But somehow that jump hasn't been made between contractors in the green energy world and pre-apprenticeship programs and workforce development programs. So, that whole step just it seems to be missing. So I don't know. I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think we do. I don't want to ask for less in this process, I guess.
can I just, thanks, Michael, maybe just another couple like kind of pieces, and I know you all are kind of talking about really complex, big kind of workforce systems. And if I can just hone back in to the micro level of the application for a minute, I did want to just maybe just elevate a couple of other pieces of feedback that we were responding to by simplifying. There was the piece that we had a race to the top and it didn't really work because we didn't get enough applicants sort of like in that pool of that kind of in that larger project size. But then we also got a lot of feedback from a lot of different organizations, small and large, that said that they felt the level of detail that was required would only be available if a project was already underway. And so we did have some applicants who were affordable housing providers who had a project that was kind of already underway. They were applying for PCEF to like add on. And so they already knew who all their contractors were. They had access to the workforce information. For everyone else, they had to just, they had to guess at that information. And so we had a lot of people saying to us, what you're going to do is end up with people who are inflate their numbers and are not able to achieve them scoring well, or people who are being more realistic scoring poorly. So that was, I think that I just wanted to sort of like maybe a little deeper into the sort of the rationale behind getting rid of the requirement for that like really detailed information about contractors, subcontractors, and workforce. And I will say from a like big organization, large organization perspective, the larger organizations came to PCEF really early on in pre-pandemic days and said, one thing that would be really helpful for us as affordable housing providers is if you would offer patient capital, if you would let your money be first in so that we could attract other money with it. And so that was something that we kind of had hoped to build in. If we want to be patient capital, we're definitely going to be putting money into projects at a point where they don't at all know who their contractors are going to be most of the time. And then from a smaller organization perspective, I think one of the things we heard is that they might not even do the project if it didn't get funded. And so they were going to wait to kind of like do the work and the effort of figuring that out after they found out if they got funded. So I just wanted to kind of like, I guess maybe just provide a little bit more background on why the sort of, it felt like an improvement to reduce the amount of like really specific information that we were asking for about the demographics of the workforce and the contractor and subcontractor pool, if that's helpful.
That is helpful. I think that as long as we're still talking about keeping in like how are you going to get diverse contractors question, not who are they, but how are you gonna recruit diverse contractors and a diverse workforce?
Yes, and it's I mean I guess I don't want to speak to, yes, that absolutely is there. Let me be very clear about that one. That question, the strategy, how are you going to approach that and do that is there. And I think that gave us a lot that we could, we saw some organizations really think thoughtfully about it. And we saw some that didn't. And so the outcomes of that we don't know yet. But that question will remain.
Ranfis?
Yeah, I think that's a helpful, framework. I assume a lot of these housing developers, as they're creating sort of their estimates or their project costs, they're probably, I would assume, trying to get feedback from multiple contractors, like what would the expenses be in terms of labor expenses, material expenses. I think I think we're getting too in the weeds right now, and I don't think that's the intent, but I would say like what's the market signal for PCEF investments to start getting a systemic change for a lot of these developers, to start asking those same contractors are asking like project costs, like material costs, like what is their diversity? Like technically those are all those similar contractors, the same folks that we would be wanting to share what the commitments are in investing in workforce training, diversifying, recruiting diverse workers, sharing how they're creating a safe work site environment. So I think I in one sense, I do understand how this is difficult here in this initial stages and why we need to figure out creative changes to make this easier and more user-friendly. But I think from a long-term perspective and the market signals that we want to start and the change in the behaviors that we want to see from developers and contractors, like I think there's got to be some kind of a market signal here from PCEF to be able to get people to start asking these questions more proactively. And if a housing developer isn't asking contractors while they're getting these price estimates to craft their budget, if they're not even asking workforce diversity or contractor diversity, I would probably point that as a systemic issue of how we're kind of sort of where we're at in the region. So I don't think it's fair to sort of assess that here. I do think it's like a great stakeholder conversation to sort of realize what are those things that really motivates diversity in the industry. But if I were a contractor and I'm getting reached out by a developer and being asked diversity questions, I'm going to change my behaviors over time for sure.
Appreciate that, Ramses. That's a really good and interesting point. I think that's the intent. I know that's probably the intention of the goals, right? Is to send those market signals and to get people out there kind of trying to like get a workforce that meets these goals. And I think what I have been hearing from folks for a while is that it doesn't, it feels like it doesn't work particularly well. So I think, maybe just think about all the places those market signals can be sent.
This is the next topic. Ramses, is that your hand? Good. Okay. Yeah. The next topic on here that we highlighted that we wanted to kind of proactively raise here was the workforce and contractor development proposal. So this is separate from the workforce and contractor utilization questions. This is related to specifically that 20 to 25% of the fund that's set aside to fund workforce and contractor development grants, so that we diversify the folks that are the very folks that we're talking about that are working on these jobs. And so some of the findings were that some of the workforce and contractor support applicants had to answer questions that just did not fit their situation, and that affected their scoring. I think generally those carried across a lot of those applications, so they were being considered similarly, but it was a point of confusion and a point of frustration for several. There are issues associated with just lumping into the same categories projects that focus on training for job placement or business assistance, and those that focus on more upstream exposure to career opportunities. So we spent a good chunk of time talking about that in the last committee meeting. And then another finding was it just wasn't always clear whether proposed programs were focused on climate-related jobs and business opportunities. So some of the staff recommendations for this is just we recommend, and you'll see next week, we created a separate application for the workforce and contractor development grant. Now, we recognize that some folks will still do some amount of workforce and contractor development sort of as part of their proposal. They may do a clean energy proposal or regenerative ag grant proposal and still do some workforce development, and we'll have scope questions we ask for those proposals, but if it's predominantly focused on workforce and contractor development, there's a separate application. We refine questions just to ensure that, and as part of that, we can simplify and make sure they're only answering the questions that are relevant to them. We refine the questions to ensure that the applicant provides a description of how the program contributes to development of a workforce and/or business that addresses climate change. And we created one question that asks whether the project has additional social or environmental benefits. And lastly, we included a question about the focus of the project so that we could prioritize the investment in training for job placement or business assistance, followed by programs that provide that more upstream exposure to climate-related opportunities, based on some of the conversation we had last week or in the last meeting. So those were some of the key changes, but I want to say that certainly the first is really separating out that application. We wanted everyone to sort of do one application, and as we reviewed, as we went through and reviewed the proposals, all the proposals, what we saw is that for the most part, most of the applications were really, they were predominant, even though an entity may have checked the box for workforce and contractor development, clean energy, green infrastructure and regenerative ag, and even innovation in some instances. For the most part, most of the projects were predominantly fell into one category. And so we said, let's, as opposed to we try to create this application that could accommodate a proposal where they came in and doing a little bit of equally of everything, it generally turned out that projects were coming in doing one type of proposal. So that's how we're separating it out. And if you're investing over a certain amount into another category, then we do still expect you to answer those scope questions so that we have a full understanding of the project. But you're gonna be ranked predominantly under your the balancing is gonna happen under the category where you fall under primarily. So are there any questions about sort of either those findings or how staff is thinking about responding to those findings and some of the recommendations that we'll be bringing, that we're sharing here, but that will play into the draft you'll see soon? Okay. Good. And then this next one, I think this next one hopefully will bring a little more satisfaction to folks, a little joy. I think what we heard is in this finding, this is number 7. We're talking about is the holistic approach to assessment of a project story. So we found a handful of findings here. There's just interest in having the application feel more streamlined and supportive of storytelling. Reviewers felt that they were able to score project components well, but did not feel they had the opportunity to score the project as a whole. There's a lot of interest in options for non-written communication, the grant application, or the clarifying questions. And then there's a request for more opportunities for applicant communication during the evaluation. So some of the recommendations that staff are making and accommodating for this is that we refine the application wording and format to streamline and promote a more cohesive story of the proposed project. So it's just making sure we're adjusting the way folks are seeing the questions so that as they're answering the questions, it's just a little bit more, makes a little more sense for them, as opposed to making sense for our scoring criteria or something else. We added a criterion that scores the project as a whole. The question is, how well does the project align with PCEF guiding principles? And it's a criteria that's not insignificant, but the intent is to give you all a little bit more of that room to reflect on the guiding principles more holistically around the project, as opposed to score each individual criteria. So that was a key change, is to add that criteria that lets you evaluate the project as a whole. We're allowing supplemental video or audio submissions to support the application. Now it is supplemental, and I hope here is that this establishes, and as part of this, we will establish parameters around length, editing, just to ensure a more level playing field, but to make sure that for folks where written word may not be the area where they excel the most, and they want to submit their application content in a different way. And this is it's around a handful of questions that we're going to allow that option. And so one thing you all have to think about is right now it's clunky. As we've evaluated how can we do that? What are the different ways folks can upload videos? How those videos accessible, whether that's YouTube or Vimeo? There's going to be an element of clunkiness. And then, lastly, one of the key changes we're going to do, and you'll see this, is just we're going to allow reviewers to ask a wider range of questions to the applicants to facilitate an understanding of the proposal. So you all reviewers on the proposal, we were trying to bound that, but we'll allow a wider range of questions and expand the opportunity for applicants to provide feedback to be more expansive in nature, supporting our understanding, as well as adding a formal point of applicant feedback for the eligibility, technical, and financial review. Now we'll still have to bound that to make sure that it's consistent, whether that's a page limit, whether that's a word limit, account limit, but we're going to just open that up a little bit, open that up more than it was, so that it allows for a little bit more opportunity for understanding between reviewers as well as the applicant. So those are some of the key changes there. And I know that we're coming up on time here, but I wanted to see if you had any questions about the findings there or the staff recommendations.
Ramses?
Yeah, sorry, I'll be brief. No, I just want to thank staff for all the work on this. I just want to say you guys have done a really amazing job of just getting all this feedback. And I think this is a great humbling experience just to like continue to improve and refine this. I think, yeah, making this more accessible for sharing narratives, I totally support that. I would just say I totally support, you know, audio or visuals. For me, the prevailing, you know, I think value for me is like, how do we continue making this application accessible for individuals who the written language is their strength, or like English is like their second language. So for me, it's like, how do we continue balancing the application for folks that's just not their strength in this space, but continue to put some heart into the application process and really try to find ways of how the application process, the selection process feels less cold, but like trying to build a relationship and get to know these organizations in meaningful ways where sometimes I think the application falls short. So I'll just wanted to share where I think I support some of these changes and what my prevailing value here is on that.
Thanks, Francis.
So I might, since we're coming up on time, I might not open up into another topic, but you know, it's with all of these, there are going to be pros and cons. I appreciate that. I appreciate the compliment. I think that we know that there's more improvements that we're going to continue to make, certainly beyond this year. And so this is sort of our first bite at this year, recognizing it. This will be a lift in and of itself. And folks will have to, you know, folks will get a feel for it. Folks that had a feel for it last year will get another feel for it. And what I'll just share is that even with what we thought was I felt like a slam dunk around creating opportunities for folks to submit feedback, you know, via audio or via media, which, you know, there are organizations that for accessibility. This is so much better for my community. This makes so much sense. And we also at the same time heard, you know, if you create that opportunity, we feel like we have to do it, and we really don't want to, you know, and it's something we, you know, if that opportunity exists, we have to do it. And I think, you know, and I think that this is where it's always important to lean into, you know, I think for you all to be thinking about the guiding principles and just reflect on what that means. But that's at least as where we stand now. We are certainly recommending that. And so I think there's going to be a good learning process with that. I don't want to promise that it's going to be smooth, but this is one of the changes that certainly a lot of us are excited about.
We have just a couple of minutes left. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Katie.
I just wanted to invite any other committee members to kind of share any closing thoughts before we close out the meeting, knowing that, you know, we'll be kind of going back and huddling and incorporating your input and trying to get material ready for you to review next week.
I just want to say thanks to the staff for compiling all of this. And I think the recommendations that you've written in the memo are clear and really helpful, especially in the format that you provided to us. So thanks for making this easy to get through.
And for folks, I thank you, Maria, for that. And I just ask, we do have the raw feedback, the more raw feedback that we're happy. We summarized it here, and I know that originally, and getting this out to you, and we got this out to you just a couple of days ago. So we recognize that you may not all have studied this memo with every detail, but I do want to acknowledge that as you have questions about anything here, certainly please just ping us and let us know. And I know we've already gotten feedback around different elements, such as the financial review already. And so as you have questions, please let us know. If you'd like to see more of the raw feedback, like we've stripped it of identifying information of interviewees. But if you'd like to see some more of that sort of raw feedback, we're also happy to share that. Because obviously this is a summary. This is a summary, that interpretations from us, but we're happy to share some of those raw, some more of that raw feedback as well if there's interest.
Okay, Sam, is there anything else that you want to share before we call it a night? And thanks to members of the public who have hung with us the whole time.
Thank you all for your thoughtfulness. Yeah, thank you all for your thoughtfulness as usual. And mini grants are due August 1st. So we'll send something out about that. So make sure there's circulate around the folks that you know and you want to know of the opportunity.
All right. Thanks all. Have a great night. We'll be talking soon.
Good night, everybody.